Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening and welcome. My name is Stephanie Fassler. I'm the International Affairs Director for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council, I welcome you to this foreign policy panel event, Nuclear North Korea, How to Respond. On behalf of the Council, I would like to thank our strategic partner, the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center, for their wonderful hospitality and making this lovely space available to us for our public programs. As mentioned, these are filmed for broadcast at a later date on our television show World Affairs Today, which airs Sunday afternoons at 3 p.m. on MHC Worldview, MHC Network's national channel. It will also be available for online on our YouTube channel after broadcast. In 2011, Kim Jong-un became the leader of North Korea after the passing of his father. Since coming to power, he has conducted more missile and nuclear tests than both his father and grandfather combined, 70 and counting. The last nuclear test was suspected to have taken place in September 2016. Since the start of 2017, North Korea has fired missiles on a number of occasions, with 3 taking place this past April. These tests have caused tensions to rise in the region around the Korean Peninsula and internationally. The U.S. has sent a carrier group to the area, raising the specter of a military confrontation. The U.S. administration has stated that all options to resolve the crisis, including diplomatic, are available, which raises the question, what is the best response and strategy for confronting a nuclear North Korea? To help us better understand the situation and options, we turn to our panel of experts. Joel Witt is a senior fellow with the U.S. Korea Institute at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He is concurrently a senior research fellow at Columbia University's Weatherhead Institute for East Asian Studies. From 1993 to 1995, Mr. Witt served as a senior advisor to the Ambassador at Large, Ambassador Robert Gallucci, helping him develop strategies to reduce North Korea's weapons program. Mr. Witt later oversaw the implementation of the U.S.-North Korea Agreed Framework from 1995 to 1999. Mr. Witt is also a veteran of the State Department's Office of Strategic Nuclear Policy. We welcome back Dr. Matthew Kroenig, who is an associate professor in the Department of Government at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He's also a senior fellow in the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security at the Atlantic Council. Dr. Kroenig has previously held several high-level positions with both the CIA and the U.S. Department of Defense, and served as senior policy advisor for both the Romney and Rubio campaigns. Dr. Kroenig has authored several books on the topics of nuclear weapons, deterrence, and non-proliferation. We also welcome back Ambassador Joseph DeTrani. He is the president of Daniel Morgan Academy and a board member of the Intelligence and National Security Alliance. Ambassador DeTrani served as the State Department's Special Envoy for the 6-party talks with North Korea from 2003 to 2006. He has held the position of Senior Advisor to the Director of National Intelligence. Ambassador DeTrani has also held a distinguished career with the CIA, serving as the Director of East Asia Operations and Director of European Operations. Our moderator for this program is Sharon Weinberger. Ms. Weinberger is Executive Editor of News at Foreign Policy. Prior to this, she was the National Security Editor at The Intercept, in charge of its defense and intelligence coverage. Additionally, she is a non-resident Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, as well as a number of other institutions and universities. Sharon is also an author, having written 3 books, the latest being The Imagineers of War, The Untold Story of DARPA, the Pentagon agency that changed the world. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelist and moderator.
So as a journalist and decidedly not an expert, what I'm going to do is simply just give a few minutes of history of the North Korean nuclear program and then leave it to our experts to talk about some of the details, but to just kind of give us the past 20 plus years. And as I looked for a good way to summarize the history of North Korea's nuclear program, it's been in some sense a mix of sanctions, diplomacy, and then the failure of both to achieve what the United States and the international community has wanted with North Korea, which is to get them to shut down their nuclear weapons program. So of the significant events of the past 20 plus years is 1994, when North Korea announced its intent to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The United States and North Korea then signed the agreed framework, which would provide a series of benefits of North Korea in exchange for its giving up its weapons program. Among other things, North Korea would agree to halt its illegal weapons program in exchange for a number of benefits, such as 2 light water reactors. That agreement collapsed in 2002. In 2003, we then saw the start of the 6-party talks to end North Korea's nuclear weapons program through negotiations, the 6 parties being China, the United States, North and South Korea, Japan, and Russia. That too broke down. In October 2006, North Korea conducted its first nuclear weapons test underground. It was less than 1 kiloton, which is the equivalent of 1,000 tons of TNT. And just by sense of comparison, the first US atomic weapons test in 1945 at Trinity was 20 kilotons, so that first test was significantly less. That first test in 2006 was followed by a call for sanctions, and United Nations sanctions were carried out that were targeted to prevent the North Korea from acquiring equipment that would help its nuclear weapons program. In May 2009, North Korea conducted its second nuclear weapons test, also underground. It produced an explosion that was estimated at about 2 kilotons, so still quite small, but more than its first test. That was followed by another round of United Nations imposed sanctions on North Korea. At that point, almost all arms imports were banned. In February of 2013, North Korea conducted another test. And as the New York Times noted at the time, in less than 2 weeks after the United Nations Security Council expanded sanctions on North Korea for a satellite launch. So that third test was estimated to yield between 6 and 7 kilotons. So again, making progress. In January 2016, there was yet another test, the 4th nuclear weapons test. The estimated explosive yield on that was between 4 and 6 kilotons. Congress responded by passing new sanctions against individuals connected with the North Korean regime, and the United Nations passed a resolution banning North Korea from conducting, quote, launches using ballistic missile technology. In September 2016, North Korea conducted yet another test, a 5th nuclear test, with a yield that was estimated at 10 kilotons, so making substantial progress at that point. There was yet another round of United Nations sanctions. So we are now up to a new administration in January of 2017, and one of the first things that happened was on February 11th, North Korea launched an intermediate range missile. This took place, as those of you remember, while President Trump was hosting Prime Minister Abe of Japan at Mar-a-Lago in Florida. This was followed up yet again on March 6th, when North Korea launched 4 ballistic missiles that flew about 620 miles. This then was followed up on April 5th, when North Korea launched a missile right before the summit between Trump and the Chinese president. That missile flew about 40 miles before falling to the sea. On April 16th, North Korea fired a missile from its eastern coast, but that launch reportedly failed. Yet again, on April 29th, North Korea launched a mid-range ballistic missile that failed just after launch. As one of our panelists, Joe Witt, wrote on April 19th in the New York Times, which I thought was a good way of summarizing the past history, for more than 60 years, North Korea has successfully resisted not only pressure from great powers, mainly the United States, but also attempts at manipulation by its patrons, the Soviet Union and China. This reflects a strong nationalism, but also a principle dear to the North Koreans, that a small country in a life or death confrontation with the world's most powerful nation, any display of weakness would amount to national suicide. I now want to take it over and leave the bulk of the time for our panelists and start with a series of questions for them. Let me start with, with Joel. In January, you wrote that Trump's only realistic option for stopping North Korea's nuclear march is this: reinvigorated diplomacy, followed by significantly ratcheting up the pressure if it fails. Can he do it? Will he? So what do you think the progress has been so far under the Trump administration?
Well, let me just very quickly say thank you for inviting me here, and I'm always sort of amused when people introduce me and say that I helped implement a failed agreement with North Korea. It really enhances my credibility a lot. Having said that, yes, I don't want to monopolize time, but I want to caution people that we had a short time to discuss the history, and the history is much more complicated than that. And it is important because it's not as black and white as it sounds. And so, for example, one of the things people say is we've negotiated and it hasn't worked. And that's not true entirely. It's true partially. So when I worked on the agreed framework, it did work. And it worked because in 1993, we expected North Korea to build almost 100 nuclear weapons by 2000, 2001, 2002. That was our intelligence estimate. When the agreement collapsed, they had enough material for less than 5. That was all because of the agreed framework. I'm saying this because Sharon has asked me about what I've said about the Trump administration, and I think we're seeing a work in progress when it comes to the Trump administration. I'd like to have a chance to talk about that more, but I don't want to monopolize the time here. And I think that the portrayal you're seeing in many of the media accounts is not entirely accurate. The administration has been ham-handed, ham-fisted. Its messages have not been clear, but I think there is an underlying theme here that negotiations are on the table in a way that I haven't seen in a very long time. To have a president of the United States, regardless of what you think of him, regardless of the words he used, hold out the possibility of a summit with a North Korean leader, I think is very interesting. So right now, the policy is still, I think, in formation. We haven't given it enough time. Just because North Korea has conducted a few missile tests, I wouldn't say it's a lost cause. I think we just need to see how it plays out.
Before I move on, then let me follow that up with one quick more. What milestones are you looking for when you say that there's still a chance, that it's a good opportunity for progress? What would be a sign that progress is being made in your view?
Well, you know, when the tensions die down, and that's another story, I think. I don't think the tensions are as bad as everyone sees in the media. I don't think we are on the brink of another Korean War. I think it's been grossly exaggerated. But when the tensions die down, an interesting question will be whether we see the United States pick up where it may have been before Kim Jong-un's brother was assassinated in Malaysia. And by that I mean that there were signs that the U.S. was going to very quietly try to re-engage North Korea in some preliminary discussions about how to find peaceful paths forward. So it may be when all the brouhaha dies down, there may be signs of that either through unofficial track 2 meetings where U.S. officials show up to meet with North Koreans. Track 2 is usually just people like me meeting with North Koreans. I have no responsibility. I'm just a private citizen. But when a U.S. government official shows up, there's something going on. Or, and there's another way which we will not see, is through the communication, the only communication channel between the United States and North Korea is through their UN mission. And so there may be more contacts gathering steam there, and that may lead to other developments.
Thank you. Matthew, why do you think then there's been such an intensification of events over the past couple of weeks? And do you agree that we have this opportunity for progress?
Well, let me also begin by thanking the World Affairs Council for hosting this important event. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank my panelists for joining me and the audience for tuning in. So as Joel pointed out, I think the history is complicated, and I think it's been really a bipartisan failure looking back. And the most recent U.S. administration to hold the baton was the Obama administration. And the label applied to the Obama administration approach to North Korea is strategic patience. So of course, whenever you apply a label to 8 years of foreign policy, it's going to be a little bit of an oversimplification. But basically, the Obama administration approach to this problem was that they didn't want to fall into what they saw as the trap of the 90s and the 2000s. And the lessons they learned from the 90s and the 2000s was that it seemed like we were in a situation where North Korea was engaging in blackmail, that we'd engage in these negotiations. The North Koreans would come to the table, we'd offer them benefits, they would agree to put limits on their program, and things would work for a while, and then North Korea would engage in another round of provocations, we'd come back, applying them with more benefits. And so the Obama administration kind of decided they weren't going to play this game, that they were going to allow North Korea to engage in these provocations, and they were going to ignore them and not reward bad behavior. So there was a certain logic to that, but I think we've seen that it hasn't really worked, and the threat has really grown over the past 8 years. So at the beginning of the Obama administration, best estimates were North Korea had enough nuclear material for maybe 6 to 8 nuclear weapons. Today, the best estimates are that North Korea might have enough nuclear material for up to 30 nuclear weapons. They have missiles capable of reaching U.S. forces and allies in the region, and they're working on solid-fueled missiles, mobile missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, intercontinental missiles. So unless the current trends are arrested, North Korea will soon have the ability to hold the continental United States at risk with nuclear attack. So I think because of that, because of the growing threat, there is a bipartisan consensus now that the United States must once again confront and engage North Korea. And I think that's what we're seeing in these early 100 days or so in the Trump administration, renewed intensification of focus on North Korea to try to resolve this issue.
And do you see in this progress?
Well, it does seem like it's a priority for the Trump administration. They've launched a number of policy reviews. This is one of the first reviews that they've announced that they've finished. Last week, of course, they invited all of the United States Senate to the White House for a briefing. Not entirely clear what the strategy is, but trying to read between the tea leaves. It seems like there may be 2 elements to the strategy, and I think the first is a diplomatic element, as Joel points out, of trying to get negotiations, but doing that through the application of military, economic, and political pressure on North Korea, trying to convince North Korea that as long as they continue down this path, their security situation is going to worsen, but hold out the prospect of negotiation to get them off of this path. But then I think the second element is that realistically, until that diplomacy succeeds, or if it never succeeds, that North Korea does have these capabilities that threaten us and our allies, and so that we do need to have a defensive and military element to the strategy as well, protecting ourselves, protecting our allies, and of course the continuation of the Obama administration THAAD policy, I think, is an example of that. I think the deployment of increased U.S. forces in the region recently is another example of that. So this is a classic foreign policy problem. There are really no good options, but I think this approach of diplomacy combined with pressure and preparing for the defense of ourselves and our allies is maybe at this point the least bad option.
So is that really any different than what previous administrations have done?
Well, I think it is. As I pointed out, the Obama administration, this wasn't a priority for the Obama administration, and their inclination was more to try to ignore these provocations. It's a little bit of oversimplification, of course. There was an attempt to get sanctions at the UN, but I do think what we've seen in recent weeks is that this is a priority of the Trump administration. There is renewed focus, and I think we've seen an intensification of the pressure in a way that we haven't seen with the Obama administration. So there's been talk of secondary sanctions, more aggressive secondary sanctions, of threatening to use sanctions against Chinese firms and Chinese banks that do business in North Korea, because that's been one of the limitations to our pressure track, is that the Chinese have the most economic leverage over North Korea, but they haven't been willing to use it. So we use these secondary sanctions to great effect in the Iran nuclear negotiations. We might be able to reuse them in the North Korea situation. And then also, I think, with the military posturing, which I think, again, has been more aggressive than under the Obama administration.
Thank you. Ambassador, it seems like a lot of the current administration is posited the idea that China can convince North Korea that it's in North Korea's interest to denuclearize. Do you think China can do that?
Well, let me just say, well, also, thank you for the invitation to the session here. The World Affairs Council does some excellent work. Thank you for this invitation. I think it's a very important panel. On the issue of China, I think we've heard a lot from the administration. President Trump had a very excellent meeting, apparently, with President Xi Jinping. Look, China, 85 to 90% of the trade with North Korea is emanating from China. Literally, almost all of the fuel that North Korea needs to sustain itself comes from China, and significant food aid. So yeah, China is a key player for North Korea. But I think we have to scroll back. I think we have to scroll back and look at the history of the Korean Peninsula also and put it in context. The context is the so-called Hermit Kingdom. We're talking about 2,000 years of recorded history. We're talking about over 900 invasions. We're talking about countries like China, Russia, Mongolia, Japan coming in often to occupy the Korean Peninsula. So there's an element here of security that permeates. It's in the literature, it's in the history books, and so forth. And China was part of that. China, you know, if you're living next to China, it's the imperial China. I'm not saying they were viewed as a vassal state, but you have to sort of be very responsive to the Middle Kingdom. So yes, China has all the cards, but China does not dictate to North Korea. China does not tell North Korea what's in your interest for your own survival, for your national security interests. China cannot, and we've seen this, tell North Korea, you must cease and desist and denuclearize. They can encourage North Korea to go that way. They can use some levers. We saw that with the six-party talks. Before we had the six-party talks, there was a few days, and this was in April of 2013, of 2003, where China, some of the fuel wasn't coming into North Korea, and there were three-party talks to establish the six-party process, which kicked in August of 2003. So yes, China has some leverage, significant I might add, but they do not dictate to North Korea. North Korea has its own interests. North Korea speaks of their nuclear weapons program as a nuclear deterrent. They cite Libya as an example of a country that gave up its nuclear weapons, and they cite some of the joint military exercises and some of the rhetoric coming out of those, of decapitating the leadership in Pyongyang. So we need to, as a former negotiator, one of the key things was to better understand your interlocutors. Where are they coming from on these issues? Because that's how we have to address it. Because what we're looking for, ladies and gentlemen, ultimately is comprehensive, verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Anything short of that it's not in the region's interest, it's certainly not in North Korea or South Korea's interest, but the region and global. Comprehensive, verifiable, and I would say for the first step, and I think this is where China can have a bit more to say to North Korea, and I think they can get them to move in that direction, which is stopping everything you're doing. You just cited the number of nuclear tests. You've cited the number of missile launches. Over the last 5 years, over 60 missile launches, 2 nuclear tests. You cited the intermediate range ballistic missile. It's not only a missile with 4,000 kilometers of reach. It's a missile that's based on its solid fuel. It's mobile. What does that tell you? It's much more difficult to discern, to locate, if you're going to do something. So North Korea over the years has become much more sophisticated, as you correctly cited, with the various nuclear tests, and with even the failures on the missile launches. They keep progressing. So what I think many of us are saying, and hopefully this, and I think with the Trump administration, I think you're hearing some of this with a willingness to sit down and talk, to put everything on the table, from negotiations to preemption, because everything needs to be on the table. Ideally, we want to go towards the negotiating route, and this is where China is. China keeps imploring the U.S. sit down with them. Yes, but not to sit down with a country that's testing, if you will, having nuclear tests, launching missiles, having YouTubes of taking New York City, Washington, D.C. out, and so forth. Some of the things we see with taking down Kim Jong-nam, his half-brother, his uncle a few years back, Jung Sung-taek. These are things that really correctly turn people off and say, what are we doing here? Is this worth doing? Yes, it is worth doing. Because this country, as Joel indicated, Matt, you indicated, and your presentation, Sharon, they are progressing. They're getting more of a nuclear weapons capability. And as they become more isolated and as sanctions continue to bite, who knows? We saw in Syria going back to 2007 when the Israelis took out al-Qabar. What was North Korea doing? They were assisting Damascus, the Syrian government, building a nuclear reactor. So do we want to be in that position? I don't think so. And so I think the off-ramp that President Trump, and I think you put it correctly, Joel and Matt, has put out there of saying we can negotiate. There is an off-ramp here. It doesn't just have to be escalation and confrontation with the possibility of something of a preemption if indeed there is an imminent threat. China is important on all of the above, but China cannot, in my view, dictate and tell North Korea cease and desist. They can influence, they can put pressure, they can move them in a direction. And we have to keep one thing in mind, and I've heard that from the Chinese often. You need someone talking to the North Koreans, someone that they would listen to. Even if they don't like you, they'll listen to you. If they're totally cut off from everyone, that's not in anyone's interest.
So do you have an assessment of the current administration's approach, both to China and North Korea, on this issue?
Well, you know, my assessment, and it's very similar to our colleagues, I'm encouraged that President Trump has put everything on the table. I'm encouraged with his comments of yesterday of saying, or 2 days ago, saying, I'm prepared to sit down with Kim Jong-un in the right conditions. I would imagine our president's not going to sit down with Kim Jong-un if he's launching missiles and having nuclear tests. And I don't think anyone's going to be sitting down if this is going to be an academic discussion, because I think we all know, certainly we've heard as negotiators, that North Korea says, treat us like Pakistan. We could be a friend, but accept us as a nuclear weapon state. And we're going into that saying no, because of nuclear proliferation for all the obvious reasons. So yes, I think the Trump administration has I think it's a strategy that's comprehensive. And hopefully North Korea will see the off-ramp, and we could move towards negotiations.
I want to go back to Joel Witt for a second. As you mentioned, things like the agreed framework weren't a failure, as you put it, because it did make progress. In looking at past negotiations and agreements with North Korea, what has worked well and what hasn't?
So you want me to talk about 30 years in 2 minutes? I can't really do that. I gave you an example of one agreement that worked well. Joe could probably give you examples of his experiences that worked well and didn't work well. I think just kind of stepping back from all the minutia that you hear about agreements, whether it's verification, whether it's denuclearization, whether it's freezes. If you step back, I think what's really important to think about is, why would North Korea reach an agreement now? What would be their motivation? How might it serve their interests? I mean, we know what kinds of agreements serve our interests. And if you think about that a little bit, and you base it on talking to North Koreans, which Joe does fairly regularly, and I do fairly regularly, there are two factors at play here. The first factor is that, yes, North Korea is building nuclear weapons, and it's building missiles to deliver them. And it's also at the same time trying to modernize its economy. That's an important objective too. So what a North Korean will tell you is, we're going to keep building missiles, keep building nuclear weapons, as long as the external security environment is very dangerous. If that changes, then we might not continue to build. They don't say, oh, we're going to give it up. That may be a bridge too far for the foreseeable future. So that's the first point. It's related to the external security factors. The second point is, and this is interrelated with that, is every state that builds nuclear weapons at some point says to itself, well, how much is enough? I mean, the United States in the 1950s was planning on building 50,000 nuclear weapons, including putting nuclear weapons on Jeeps. Well, that's probably a little too much. And actually, under the Kennedy administration, people decided we have to be more realistic. It's true for all the countries that build nuclear weapons, and it's probably true for the North Koreans. I think they are going through a constant thought process of how much is enough. And under the current circumstances, I don't think they can ever get enough. But if the environment changes, they might change. And this relates back to the agreed framework. The agreed framework was only possible because of geopolitical shifts. The collapse of the Soviet Union, North Korea's main ally, the effort by China to reach out to South Korea, which of course the North Koreans didn't like, and their conclusion that they needed to do something. They were becoming increasingly isolated, and that's why they reached out to the United States. So if you look at these bigger factors and get past all the, the details, these are the things that are in the back of North Koreans' minds, and we should understand that, because Joe is absolutely right. You need to understand who you're dealing with and what they're thinking.
Actually, I have another question for the ambassador. You talked about sort of this portrayal of the hermit kingdom, and so maybe this is a sort of a reflective question from a journalist. We love in the press to kind of portray these crazy stories about North Korea. And actually what's been presented here is, in some sense, the very rationality that it operates under sometimes. What do you think of the portrayal of North Korea in the press here?
I think it's an understandable portrayal. I'm not going to criticize the media on its portrayal, given some of the externals we've seen with the YouTubes and some of the others, but it's very simplistic. And in many ways, it's, I mean, if you're, I know when we would sit down and have discussions with our interlocutors, and as Joel indicated, a number of these are the track 2 type discussions, not formal discussions, but we're dealing with them. I mean, they, the humor with one's haircut and behavior, and it's a bit of diminishing the if you will, the credibility of their leader. And so I think it's not deep. Joel mentioned a minute ago the economy. I mean, we hear about nuclear, and correctly so, and the missile launches, absolutely, no question. But there are 23 million people, and it's a stark environment. There's Pyongyang and the rest of North Korea. And to get an understanding of what's going on in that country and so forth, the economic dynamics, we're seeing a little of that now with small plots, and maybe what we saw in China in the 60s, early 70s, where people are trying to sustain their existence, and getting a little deeper into it. Maybe so I would think, but I'm not faulting the media, because you can only use what you have access to, and the access is minimal, and you see just those externals. But there's much more to North Korea and the issues related to, and which is what they seek, a normal relationship with a country like, indeed, the United States. That's what they want. Ultimately, that's what they want. And we make it very clear, we've made it very clear, certainly with our joint statement in 2005, to get a normal relationship with the United States. Not only do you need to address the nuclear, comprehensive, verifiable denuclearization, but then you need to work on issues and give us transparency and progress on issues like human rights, illicit activities, things along those nature. And that's important. So I think the media could hopefully get a little deeper into it, but they would need significant access to do that, I would imagine.
Before I turn it over to the audience, you mentioned the 2005 joint statement. Can you talk about that just a little bit and why it failed?
It took 2 years. This is September 19th, 2005. We started the six-party process in August of 2003. Within 2 years, many meetings, plenary meetings, task force meetings, and so forth, we were able to come up with a joint statement that we all could agree to. Prior to that, over this 2-year period, we just couldn't come to agreement on a joint where everyone agreed, the 6 parties agreed. It was mostly North Korea not agreeing. But in this case, we came to an agreement, a joint statement, where North Korea committed to comprehensive, verifiable, denuclearization. Now, let me emphasize this, actions for actions. It's not one-sided. So when we talk about North Korea denuclearization, they're talking about security assurances. They need security assurances because, again, they use their nuclear weapons, as they put it, it's their nuclear deterrent. So they need a discussion, and they need progress on issues like security assurance and where we're going, whether it be peace treaty, moving towards normal relationships, economic development issues, civilian nuclear. We talked about the agreed framework that was building two significant civilian light water reactors, the ability to give them civilian nuclear capabilities for their industry, for their people. And that was part of it, coming back to the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. So it was a very comprehensive, with many task force going out there. So the experience from that, and I go back to what Joel said on the agreed framework, we had 2 instances where North Korea agreed to, and in fact did, halt what they were doing. And yes, you could say with the agreed framework, then they pursued a different path. You can say with the joint statement, they were not keen on extensive monitoring and verification. But the fact of the matter is, we made progress in both instances to stop what was going on, to move towards something that lent itself to denuclearization. So the failure on that, indeed it was a failure, because we don't have what we were looking for. But the failure on that was on the part of all parties. But indeed, the North Koreans, when they refused to permit the monitors to leave Yongbyon, which was an oral agreement we, lead negotiator had, and refused to put it in writing, we said, this doesn't work. If you're committed to comprehensive, verifiable denuclearization and you're permitting monitors to come in and so forth, we had an understanding that they could leave that one facility that you give us access to, Yongbyon, where they're reprocessing spent fuel for plutonium. And they said, they weren't prepared to put it in writing and sign something. So if there was a mistake on that, maybe we should have worked harder on that. It shouldn't have been sort of, a drop-dead issue. Okay, that's it. Uranium enrichment in 2002. We heard you say you have a uranium enrichment program. Well, let's discuss. Maybe we needed to persist and work those very difficult issues rather than saying that's it.
Thank you. So I'd like at this point to open it up for questions.
Previously, I was with the State Department, and I wanted to ask about the terrorism designation. I believe it was the Bush administration where we removed the designation of North Korea as a state sponsor. So now that the new administration has embarked on its review of North Korea policy, we've had the really egregious assassination with a chemical agent of the brother-in-law. I wanted to ask each of you why you think the administration hasn't, should it, say, redesignated them. Is this a bargaining chip, or they think it conversely would sour the possibilities for resuming negotiations? And secondly, if I might, you've talked about the geographic context. I wondered if you could, each or all of you, say a little bit more about the Republic of Korea and Japan, particularly with the elections coming up in the Republic of Korea and any effects that could have on the situation. Thank you again.
Well, I guess I get to go first here. So first on the terrorism designation, I mean, I think I agree with some of Joel's analysis earlier, but maybe come out to a different place in terms of the recommendation, because I do think that part of the reason we got the agreed framework in 1994 is that North Korea felt like it was isolated. I think if we look at the Iran nuclear deal, which was recently reached, we saw that what worked there was pressure. And with North Korea today, I agree that North Korea sees this nuclear and missile program as one of the things that's providing for its security. So I think diplomacy is going to be incredibly hard. I don't think any of us should be optimistic about our prospects. But I think if it's going to work, the key is going to be convincing North Korea that its future is brighter giving up the nuclear program than it is keeping the nuclear program. So I think to make that work, you have to convince Kim Jong-un that the situation, as long as he pursues these capabilities, is going to get worse and worse and worse in terms of economic, political, military pressure. And so I think a designation as a state sponsor of terror would contribute to that and would therefore make sense. In terms of why the administration hasn't done it yet, it's still early, but as Ambassador DeTrani said earlier, they've said all options are on the table, and so I think that's something that's still being considered. On Korea and Japan, I was in both Tokyo and Seoul just a few months ago, met with many officials in both places, including Chairman Moon, who is likely going to be next president of South Korea. And in these meetings, in all these meetings, the issue number 1, 2, and 3 was North Korea. There's a lot of concern in both countries. It's hard to overstate it. And I think the United States and Japan and South Korea have been able to work with our allies in the region very effectively across administrations. And I don't see any difference here. I think the United States and South Korea under new leadership will be able to continue to work together to address the North Korea threat.
Could I just make 2 points here? The first point is, the media, which I'm happy to criticize, as Joe isn't, the media often, and I deal with them all the time, we have a regular press breakfast, we have 30 reporters show up, so it's not a problem. The media often portrays us, experts, pundits, talking heads, as either pro-engagement or not pro-engagement. And it's so artificial, it's just not correct. For people who are interested in diplomacy, of course, sanctions and other steps to put pressure on North Korea are important. That's what coercive diplomacy is about. No one's saying we shouldn't do that. It's just an issue of timing and how do you coordinate the two. On the terrorism designation, I really am sort of agnostic on that because, quite frankly, we can keep piling sanctions on the North Koreans and it's not going to have much effect on them. So we can do it, we may not do it, I don't know. Secondly, on the issue of South Korea, well, I don't know. I don't disagree with Matt, but I'm not so sanguine about, we're all going to be able to work together fine. Because the new South Korean president, if it is Moon Jae-in, is going to be much more into engaging North Korea. He wants to reopen the joint industrial zone that was closed down by President Park, his predecessor. And these are going to be issues that are going to be irritants in the U.S.-South Korean relationship. But if President Trump, if our analysis is correct, and the Trump administration is more into engagement than many people think it is, then that may be the basis for creating some common ground with the new South Korean president. We'll have to wait and see. So I think there's a possibility of tensions there, and we just have to keep that in mind as we move forward with our North Korea policy as well.
So let me just very briefly further to my colleagues on the terrorism list. They were taken off the list in 2007, as you correctly stated, during the Bush administration. And that was a movement towards implementing the 2005 joint statement. They had taken down the cooling tower, they brought monitors in, and so forth. So this was, and mind you, actions for actions. That was the whole basis for the joint statement. North Korea would move towards dismantling their nuclear infrastructure, and the other 5 countries would move to give them greater security assurances, economic development assistance, et cetera. And in this case, the terrorism list was it. And again, there was also technically, there were no events since the taking down of the Korean Airlines flight during the Seoul Olympics, I believe it was 1988, that was of a terrorist nature. So it was justifiable technically to take them off the list because they have no occurrence of a terrorist action in 2007. There is legislation, I believe the Congress, the House of Representatives is moving to reinstate North Korea and to put them back on the terrorism list. So there is legislation pending. It's coming out of the House of Representatives, and that there's a process, as we all know, with the House of Representatives to the Senate. But there is a movement within our Congress to reinstate them on the terrorism list. Whether they should be or not, I'm also agnostic. I mean, I think we need to be careful at this phase because we're at a tipping point. Because things have escalated so quickly, as your summation had indicated, so quickly, nuclear, missiles, rhetoric going back and forth, and as Matt indicated, the corporate we, could stumble, miscalculate something. So adding something, and indeed more sanctions are being applied, correctly so. There may be secondary sanctions, correctly so. Countries like China will take note of that, correctly so. So that, I would just say, we have to be very cautious on that, and I'm sure the Trump administration is very mindful of that. Look, Japan and South Korea, we talk about the potential for an ICBM launch that could touch the whole of the United States, the KN-08. We talk about that. And the assessment is, with given the fact that North Korea has nuclear weapons, and many assess, I'm one of them, and they've been able to miniaturize it, then it's a question of mating it to those delivery systems. So therefore, within 2, 3, 4 years, it could be North Korea will be an existential nuclear threat to the United States. South Korea and Japan have been living under those circumstances for years, And it's our extended nuclear deterrence, it's our commitment. That's why the introduction of THAAD, missile defense is so important. Reassuring our allies in the Republic of Korea and Japan that we're there for you. And that we will work on the missile defense. And hopefully if Moon Jae-in gets elected, the government, listening to the constituents, would say this makes eminent sense. If there's a potential threat, nuclear or conventional, you would want to mitigate that. So having missile defense makes sense, and also building that trilateral. And that's important, that trilateral element of bringing the U.S., South Korea, and Japan. And we are cooperating in a trilateral basis on many things related to North Korea, which is very positive. So I think the U.S. is very mindful of our two allies, and we should never forget that. And indeed, in our negotiations, even exploratory discussions, North Korea, our allies in South Korea and Japan need to be very, very much part of that process.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm going to call this thinking out of the box. Maybe it's not thinking out of the box, but we'll get an opinion here. From what I know about North Korea, and I don't know anywhere near what you folks know, the only priority that Kim Jong-un has is to survive in power. Not only to survive in power, but presumably it's going to be run like history. He'll have a son and or a grandson. In other words, the entire family wants to survive. That's their primary importance. Not the nutritional status of the people in North Korea. It's their survivability. So is it possible, I call this anybody who's seen the Godfather movie, an offer that they can't refuse. And what I'm thinking of is, could the powers that be, the U.S., Russia, Japan, South Korea, guarantee not only the survivability, but guarantee the continuation of power for that family for a very, very long period of time if they give up the nuclear weapons? One of the things I'm encouraged by in the Trump administration, I'm not encouraged much by what Trump has done or not done, is that he hasn't used the word regime change. I haven't heard it come out of the administration, which means that it sounds like they're willing to have this guy stay in power. Now, this might not make the South Koreans happy, but that's not all. Well, I don't want to be so cavalier, but in the interest of the United States, I don't think it's that much of an issue. So what is the probability that eventually the ultimate offer, the grand bargain, could be presented to him and his family, that they will, in effect, guarantee their viability there if they give up the nuclear program?
Can I just take 1 second and defer to my colleagues? Because this has come up in our negotiations with the North Koreans many times. What the U.S. has said in the past, and I believe that is our view, it's not regime change. We've heard that from the Trump administration. We're not looking for regime change. We could give those assurances. So when they speak of security assurances, we can give you those assurances. And indeed, if you move towards diplomatic relations, that's the best security assurance, isn't it? But what we can tell you is the survival of a regime, because there's a dynamic from within your own country that you control, we don't control.
Yeah, I agree with that, but it goes further than assurances because, you know, for a North Korean, our assurances aren't worth the paper they're written on. So it goes a lot further than that, and this is where you get to their view of where a negotiation would go in the future. And I think it gets at what you're driving at, maybe not in such a stark way where we say, oh yeah, you, the Kim family, you're guaranteed. It's not like that. It's more like, you know, we respect your sovereignty and we're not going to do regime change. And indeed, Secretary Tillerson and others have said that very explicitly recently. So the bigger issue here is if you're a North Korean and you want to feel like your system is guaranteed, your security is guaranteed, you want to move away from the current confrontation to a situation where tensions go down, and you want to be on the path, for example, to replacing the armistice that ended the Korean War, with a permanent peace arrangement, which symbolizes your acceptance by other countries, as well as the move towards more normal relations. How far we get down that road, of course, is a big issue, and Joe has mentioned there are other issues in the relationship. But moving down that road at least would accomplish what you're talking about and might also help us move down the road of stopping and maybe even rolling back the nuclear threat.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask, given the discernible ebb and flow of the security environment on the Korean Peninsula, are there any verifiable, discernible indicators that you'd see that would suggest a deterioration in the security environment, particularly as it would affect Seoul and Tokyo? I mean, I know that they're well in range of the missiles that North Korea is known to have, but what indicators do you see that would suggest an imminent deterioration of that security environment?
Well, as I talked about before, the growth in North Korean capabilities is one of the threats both to us and to our allies, and so I think, you know, those are the indicators that we're seeing get worse and worse. Just you know, estimates of the amount of fissile material they could have produced, range and sophistication of their missiles, mobile missiles, which makes it harder for us to track and target them in the event of a conflict. But in terms of protecting our allies, you know, there are some interesting ideas out there, and one of them I've heard is, you know, of course we have the THAAD missile defense to deal with missiles, but as I think you alluded to in your question, one of the big threats is the artillery and short-range rockets they have on the Kaesong Heights, which can hold Seoul and U.S. forces in Korea at risk. And so one of the ideas that's been floated is encouraging cooperation between South Korea and Israel, because Israel over the past several years has developed these pretty sophisticated defenses, Iron Dome, Arrow 3, and other things to protect against rockets from Hamas and Hezbollah. And so there may be an opportunity there for South Korea to purchase or develop some of these systems as a way to limit their exposure to the threat coming from the Kaesong Heights.
When you say imminent deterioration, I am assuming you're talking about all this talk about, you know, the possibility of another Korean War, which of course would be the most you could get in terms of a deterioration. And I'm going to take this opportunity to say that I think that's really been grossly exaggerated. And you don't see the kinds of things you would see on the ground if there was a danger, an imminent danger of another Korean War. You don't see North Korea closing its borders. You don't see North Korea evacuating its cities. You probably don't see unusual types of troop movements in North Korea. And I'm willing to bet, I don't know what they call it anymore, and Joe knows about this, but we used to have a very elaborate system, warning of war indicators on the Korean Peninsula. And I bet you that's not indicating war. And you don't see the sorts of things in South Korea, similar sorts of things you'd see. And on top of that, a day before, you know, the recent 25th Army anniversary, which was being hyped as another possible flashpoint, you saw Kim Jong-un visiting a pig farm. And it was in the North Korean media, highlighted in the North Korean media. So, you know, I think, I know everyone is nervous about the possibility of another Korean War, but I think we really need to dig beneath the surface of a lot of what's appearing in the press.
And apparently the people in, many of the people in South Korea are pretty calm. They're not overly excited about it. So maybe because they've experienced this for so many decades and what have you, but I totally agree with my colleague.
I mean, in 1994, we saw South Koreans going to the supermarkets, you know, stocking up. And we didn't quite see it yet, but there was the danger that foreigners were going to head to the airport to get out of South Korea. You don't see any of that. And I bet you would if there was a real danger.
And if I could just add one quick point on that, I agree with my colleagues. And, you know, I think many people were worried by this quote Trump had several days or a week or so ago when he said there could be a major, major conflict. And I think that worried a lot of people. But you know, I think it's important to remember that, you know, it's our first president who hasn't served in political office, hasn't served in the military. And so I think he was using kind of everyday language, whereas, you know, most politicians would use a more coded language. You know, I think an Obama or a Bush might have said all options on the table. That's what I heard from that comment. Not that he was planning an imminent war, but rather that we had to be prepared for all contingencies, including the possibility of a North Korean attack.
So you guys have talked a lot about the fact that you don't believe that a conflict is imminent and that the media may be overblowing things. Do you think there is a point of no return, though, where a conflict would just, it's going to happen either way?
Well, I don't think it's inevitable by any means, but I do think it's important that the United States and our allies be prepared. You know, North Korea does pose a serious threat. It's possible that they could use, you know, chemical weapons or a nuclear weapon against Seoul tomorrow, and we'd have to be prepared for conflict. Saying among U.S. forces in Seoul is, common saying is fight tonight. Not that they want to fight tonight, but they have to be ready every night. So it is a serious situation. North Korea has one of the most capable militaries on earth, and so we need to be prepared for it, but I don't see conflict as inevitable at all, and I think if we get the strategy right, that it's even less likely.
Thank you so much, Sharon, Ambassador DeTrani, Dr. Kroenig, Joel, for all your expertise and sharing your time with us this evening. Please join me in thanking them.
Thank you, Sharon. Appreciate it. I'll see you.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.